Nobody expected the cameras to capture the moment when a celebrated actress tried to publicly dismantle a young musician, and instead revealed her own unraveling. What began as a routine live television discussion would turn into one of the most uncomfortable cultural clashes of the 1960s, a moment when arrogance met authenticity under unforgiving studio lights. This is the story of how Bob Dylan walked into a New York television studio already judged, already dismissed, and unknowingly stepped into a confrontation that would test not his talent, but his dignity. April 9, 1966, Westbridge Television Theater, Manhattan. The air inside Studio B felt stale and tense hours before the broadcast even began, as if the walls themselves sensed the collision coming. Crew members moved with forced cheer, cables snaked across the floor, stagehands whispered instead of spoke. This wasn't the usual nervous energy before a live show. It was something heavier, sharper. Bob Dylan arrived just after noon, alone, no entourage, no bravado, carrying his acoustic guitar in a scuffed case that looked like it had lived a hard life. At 24, he was already a lightning rod. To some, a poet and prophet. To others, an irritant, an upstart with a nasal voice and dangerous ideas. Fame had found him fast and violently, and he wore it like an ill-fitting coat. He nodded politely to staff, found a quiet corner backstage, and sat down, tuning his guitar not because it needed it, but because it gave his hands something to do. Across the studio, Vivian Hartwell arrived like a procession. 2 assistants, a wardrobe specialist, a producer practically bowing as he guided her toward her dressing room. Hartwell was 53, a titan of stage and screen, trained in the classics, decorated with awards, her voice once described by critics as cut crystal wrapped in velvet. She had built a second career out of television appearances, not as a performer, but as a cultural authority. Her opinions could make or break reputations. Young artists feared her. Producers relied on her. And she despised what modern music represented. During rehearsals, she didn't acknowledge Dylan at all. Not a glance. Not a nod. When a junior producer mentioned his name while reviewing the rundown, Hartwell raised an eyebrow and said, "Oh, is that what passes for art now?" Loud enough for half the room to hear. Laughter followed, thin, nervous, obligatory. The show's host, Leonard Moore, sensed the danger immediately. Moore was a professional mediator, a man whose entire career rested on keeping conversation civilized, but even he struggled to disguise his concern. He pulled Dylan aside briefly, speaking in a low voice. "She can be sharp," he warned gently. "Just answer calmly. We'll get through it." Dylan smiled faintly, more tired than confident. "I'm not worried," he said, though his eyes suggested otherwise. What worried him wasn't criticism. He'd lived with that for years, but being reduced, simplified, turned into a symbol he no longer controlled. The network had framed the segment as a generational dialogue, but everyone backstage knew it was closer to a trial. Hartwell had requested the format herself. Extended conversation before any performance. No edits. Live broadcast. She wanted words before music. She wanted him exposed before he was heard. As the hours crawled toward airtime, tension seeped into every corner. A makeup assistant whispered to another that Hartwell planned to teach the boy a lesson. A sound engineer muttered that the audience was stacked with Hartwell supporters, older patrons, theater donors, society figures. Dylan's fans were few and scattered. At 6:55 p.m., the audience filed in. Polite applause filled the room as Hartwell took her seat on stage, elegant and composed, legs crossed, chin lifted. Dylan sat opposite her, guitar resting against his chair, posture relaxed but guarded. The countdown began. 5 minutes. Hartwell leaned toward Moore and said, smiling sweetly, "Let's hope." "This is enlightening." Dylan stared at the floor. 30 seconds. The red light flickered. And in that instant, before a single word was spoken on air, the outcome already felt inevitable, not because of who would win, but because one of them had already decided the other did not deserve to. The program opened with applause, theme music swelling, Moore's warm voice welcoming millions of viewers into their living rooms. Hartwell was introduced first, her accolades recited like scripture. The audience roared approval. Then Dylan's name followed. The applause was softer, curious, divided. Hartwell turned her head slightly toward him, just enough to be seen on camera, and smiled, not with warmth, but with calculation. She had waited for this moment. And Bob Dylan, sitting beneath the glare of live television, unaware of how deeply this encounter would echo beyond the studio walls, waited too, quietly, patiently, on the edge of something that could either diminish him or define him forever. The tension that had been coiled backstage finally snapped the moment the pleasantries ended, and the cameras caught exactly what Vivian Hartwell had come to do. As the applause faded, she turned fully toward Bob Dylan, studying him the way a critic studies a weak performance, lips curved in a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Dylan," she began, voice smooth and perfectly projected, "you're often described as the conscience of a generation. I've always wondered who decided that." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, encouraged, expectant. Dylan lifted his eyes, calm on the surface, though his fingers tightened slightly around the neck of his guitar. "I didn't decide it," he replied evenly. Hartwell nodded, as if confirming a private suspicion. "Of course not. It's just that I find it curious how little training seems required these days to be called an artist." Leonard Moore shifted in his chair, sensing the direction, but Hartwell pressed on before he could soften the moment. "Tell me," she said, leaning forward, "can you read music?" The question landed hard, sharper than it sounded, and the audience grew quiet. Dylan paused. Not long, just long enough for the cameras to capture his stillness. "Not the way you mean," he said. Hartwell smiled. "So you cannot." She turned slightly toward the audience. "Fascinating, isn't it? A man celebrated for music who cannot read it." The laughter this time was louder, less nervous. Encouraged, Hartwell continued, her tone sharpening. "And yet you lecture audiences about society, morality, politics. Do you feel any responsibility to master your craft before instructing others?" Dylan's voice remained controlled. "I don't lecture," he said. "I write songs. People decide what they hear in them." Hartwell let out a soft, theatrical sigh. "How convenient." She straightened, crossing her legs. "You see, I come from a tradition where discipline matters. Years of study, failure, humility, not applause handed out because one happens to annoy the right people at the right time." Moore attempted to interject. "Vivian, perhaps," but she cut him off with a gentle wave, never breaking eye contact with Dylan. "I'm simply asking what qualifies this," she said, gesturing vaguely toward him, "as art." Dylan swallowed. The studio lights felt hotter now, closer. He could feel the audience leaning in, waiting for him to crack, to stumble into anger or embarrassment. "I don't know if it qualifies," he said quietly. "I just know it's honest." Hartwell laughed again, this time openly. "Honesty is not a substitute for skill." She tilted her head. "Do you truly believe these songs will matter in 20, 30 years? Or are they just fashionable noise, destined to fade once the youth grow bored?" The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. This was no longer discussion. It was an indictment. Dylan glanced briefly toward Moore, then back to Hartwell. "I don't write for years," he said. "I write for now." A murmur spread through the audience, some approving, some dismissive. Hartwell seized on it. "Exactly," she said. "Ephemeral. Disposable. Unlike the works of Shakespeare, Bach, or Sophocles. Art that endures because it is built on mastery." She leaned back, satisfied, as if the verdict had already been delivered. "This program," she added coolly, "is meant to celebrate culture. I worry we're confusing popularity with value." For a moment, it seemed Dylan might say nothing more. He sat still, eyes lowered, absorbing the weight of her words. The camera lingered on his face, searching for humiliation, for anger, for defeat. Instead, when he spoke again, his voice was softer, steadier. "I don't think culture belongs to one group," he said. "I think it belongs to whoever needs it." Hartwell's smile tightened. "A sentimental answer," she replied. "But sentimentality has never been a reliable measure of greatness." The audience chuckled, though the sound was thinning now, less certain. Moore cleared his throat again, more firmly this time. "Perhaps we should let Bob perform," he suggested, trying to regain control. Hartwell hesitated, just a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Very well," she said. "Let us hear what all the fuss is about." She turned her gaze away, folding her hands in her lap, expression composed but alert. Dylan rose from his chair slowly, walking to the microphone at center stage. The applause was scattered, unsure. As he adjusted the mic, the cameras caught Hartwell watching him. not with amusement now, but with a narrowed focus, as if something unexpected had entered the equation. Dylan rested the guitar against his body, took a breath, and glanced once at the audience before lowering his eyes again. The studio fell silent. In that silence, something subtle but unmistakable had shifted. The actress had finished her attack. The questions, the mockery, the judgments had all been delivered. What came next would no longer belong to words. And for the first time since the broadcast began, it was no longer clear who was on trial. The first note didn't announce itself. It slipped into the studio almost apologetically, a soft strum that barely disturbed the air. Bob Dylan stood alone beneath the lights, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes half closed, as if retreating inward rather than performing outward. The song unfolded slowly, unadorned, his voice rough but deliberate, carrying words that spoke of judgment, distance, and the quiet loneliness of being misunderstood. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't polished. But it was unmistakably real. The cameras drifted across the audience and captured the change as it happened. Folded arms loosening, skeptical expressions softening, a few heads nodding unconsciously to a rhythm they hadn't expected to feel. The room grew still, not out of politeness, but attention. When Dylan reached the final line, he didn't linger. The last chord rang out and faded naturally, and he stepped back from the microphone without looking up. For a brief moment, there was silence. Not the awkward kind that begs for applause, but the heavier kind that follows something honest. Then a single clap echoed from the back of the studio. Another followed. Within seconds, the sound swelled into a full standing ovation, surprising even those who were on their feet. Dylan blinked, clearly caught off guard, and gave a small nod, gratitude without triumph. The camera cut to Vivian Hartwell. She remained seated. Her posture was still elegant, still composed, but the certainty that had defined her earlier was gone. She looked thoughtful now, almost unsettled, as if forced to confront something she hadn't planned to meet. Leonard Moore turned gently toward her. "Vivian," he prompted. She inhaled slowly before speaking. "It would be dishonest," she said carefully, "to pretend that moved me in the way I usually expect music to." A pause. "But it would be equally dishonest to deny that it moved me at all." The audience murmured. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't dismissal either. Dylan met her gaze briefly and inclined his head, offering nothing more and nothing less than respect. The broadcast wrapped shortly after, the usual closing remarks feeling strangely small compared to what had just taken place. When the cameras finally shut off, the spell broke. Crew members exhaled, voices returned, and applause gave way to conversation. Hartwell stood, exchanged a polite word with Moore, and left the stage without approaching Dylan. There was no confrontation, no reconciliation, just distance, and the quiet acknowledgement that something had not gone according to plan. By the next morning, the newspapers had chosen their side. Critics debated the performance, the questions, the tension, but nearly all agreed on one thing. The attempted takedown had failed. Viewers wrote in by the thousands, not to argue about technique or tradition, but to describe how the song had made them feel. Hartwell's remarks were replayed, analyzed, softened by some, condemned by others. Dylan's performance was replayed too, unchanged, unedited, allowed to speak for itself. Years later, that broadcast would be remembered not for who spoke more sharply, but for who needed to speak the least. An actress had arrived armed with words, credentials, and certainty. A musician had arrived with only a guitar and a song. And when the moment demanded an answer, it turned out that one honest performance could say more than any argument ever could.